All right, we're back on the Fireside PM live stream and podcast, and I've got Teresa Torres, who is a expert in the area of product discovery. Welcome to the show, Teresa. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Um, Maybe we should start with a little bit of background on how you got into this area and what you do, and then we'll kind of double click into product discovery specifics afterwards.
Yeah, perfect. So today I work as a product discovery coach. That means I help teams make better decisions about what to build. I got into this. I'll kind of work backwards. Most of my full-time employee experience was at really early stage startups. So I was the 10th employee, the 23rd employee. I think at the biggest company I worked at, I was the 52nd employee. So much smaller than where a lot of people work. And for folks that have worked in companies that small, you tend to play multiple roles. There's more work to do than there are people. My first several roles, I was always in a hybrid role. So my first job, I was a front-end engineer and an interaction designer. In my second job, I had the same titles and then eventually became a designer and a product manager. And then once I sort of hit the director level, I started to focus. I became a director of product management. The same company I moved from actually came in as their director of UX and then immediately moved into director of product. And then over a course of a few years, became their VP of product and then eventually their CEO. What I learned from running a small startup, especially we were a recruiting startup and I became the CEO in 2009. For anybody who needs a reminder of what that was like, it was in the heart of the 2008 sort of financial collapse. Our customers at the time were companies who were hiring, which was nobody, and universities. And universities had lost pretty much most of their funding during that time period. So as you can imagine, that was a tough situation. That was sort of my first introduction to how people resist change, even when your market is telling you need to change. And this was really eye-opening to me. I started to recognize that we need to do some things radically differently. Our market has completely changed in about 90 days. And yet my team is struggling. And so that got me interested in understanding organizational change and why do people resist change. And that got me into the coaching world. I did a master's in learning and organizational change to kind of understand some of that stuff. And then I went on to my last startup. I ran a product and design team at another startup that was also in a similar situation, not economically, but they were sort of torn between two paths. They couldn't get agreement on those two paths. And watching that made me realize too many companies are making decisions without feedback from their customers. And we're making our day-to-day lives harder than they need to be. And so that was really the catalyst for me wanting to really help teams spend more time with customers, build in better feedback loops, and especially learn how to use those feedback loops reliably.
So, in the example of the recruiting startup where the market had changed after the financial crisis and there was a lot of resistance to it, I'm guessing, the people you worked with or the other stakeholders logically understood that the market was changing and there were these kind of large factors, and maybe you were hearing from customers as well. Why do you think it was so hard for them to embrace new directions in the face of all of the facts?
I think change is hard for all humans, just full stop, right? We get comfortable with what we know. There's a lot of cognitive biases related to this. We just get really comfortable with what we know. We assume what has worked for us in the past will work for us in the future. Every organization I've ever interacted with, whether as an employee, whether as a coach, has strong organizational beliefs that are held as truths. And a lot of times things change and those truths become less true. And this is just human nature, right? We need data to tell us there's a gap in what we believe or what we think. And if we're not actively seeking that data, if we're not actively looking for feedback loops, if we're not actively listening to the market, we're not going to see that the world has changed around us. And so I think for me, one of the mistakes I made early on in my career is I thought it was good enough for me to go and talk to customers and then bring it back to my team. And the challenge with that is that I got to see it firsthand. I got to really integrate that new data, but my team didn't. My team, it's really easy when you're not involved in collecting the feedback to interpret it as, oh, that's just Tom's opinion. I didn't see it firsthand. I don't have evidence of that. I'm not going to change my worldview. And that really convinced me that we need everybody in the organization to be engaging with customers. We need everybody. We can't just have one role focused on customer centricity. We all have to be involved. We all have to have feedback loops in our jobs and in our roles if we're going to act on it.
You described a scenario, Teresa, where you were the CEO at the time and you were out there hearing from customers and developing that kind of insight into how things were on the ground. And you struggled with maybe other parts of the team who weren't hearing it firsthand, and they were like, well, that's just Teresa's opinion. What about the inverse, where I've talked to people in the past where they say, hey, I'm the one talking to the customers, I'm the PM, but our leadership is not, and they have this conviction, and it's hard for me to break through because they might argue, well, look, we're creating a new market. Of course the customers aren't going to get it right away, and we should kind of stick true to like our beliefs.
Yeah, so it's really easy if you're an individual contributor to just say, my leadership is dumb and they don't get it, right? Again, I'm going to say what I said earlier. All humans resist change, full stop, right? And the only way we break through that is we need firsthand personal exposure to why we need to change. And so when we're talking about leaders that are resisting change, or leaders that don't trust their teams, or leaders that are struggling to empower their teams, we're seeing a lot of this right now. So we're in an economic climate where cash is no longer free. And a lot of companies are having to grow up a little bit in terms of their practices. And what we tend to see happen when things get tougher is we tend to revert back to our old habits. We tend to try to control more. We're seeing this at a lot of organizations where companies are shifting back to more of a command and control management process. And again, it's really easy if you're an individual contributor on one of those teams to say, oh, they just don't get it. They're making bad decisions. But I think we actually play a role in influencing those decisions and influencing that command and control environment. I wrote an article years ago about the key to productive stakeholder management. And that's, if you go to a stakeholder and they're more senior to you in the organization, and you say, I think we should build this, and they say, no, I think we should build this other thing, you're not going to win that argument. You shouldn't be presenting your conclusions. You should be presenting what you're learning along the way and helping that stakeholder get to a better conclusion. Because the reality is, in our organizations, the people more senior to you are going to make more decisions. And especially the more like the purse strings get tighter, the more critical decisions seem to make, which is what happens in a tougher economic climate, the more we're going to fall back on those old patterns of, I'm going to control everything. So the way that we influence in that type of environment is we have to bring new data to the conversation. We have to introduce new feedback loops into the conversation. And it might be that you used to be able to say, hey, Tom, I had this conversation with this customer. Here's what I learned. And your stakeholder took that and was happy with it. Now you might have to do even more. Now you might have to share a video clip of what the customer said. You might have to invite that stakeholder to that conversation and to be a part of it, right? So what used to be easy now might be a lot harder. And so we have to adapt and we have to adjust our methods. But I think fundamentally what it comes down to is, how do we get the people that are making the decisions, whether that's the individual contributors or the leaders, it does not matter. Humans are involved. How do we get them firsthand exposure to the people impacted by what we're building?
Teresa, I wanted to get your thoughts on a related topic, which is the importance of product discovery as a ongoing effort versus a one and done kind of thing. I've noticed in my experience that, especially if it's a new area that the organization is looking to go into, there's generally a strong appetite for a lot of product discovery work and customer research. And then as a product evolves and becomes like a real thing, gets launched, the emphasis is tends to be more around, hey, let's get launches and landings, let's keep incrementally improving, and we don't often go back and challenge or reconfirm kind of core assumptions that we had when we started the project. How do you suggest people kind of navigate that evolution of product discovery from kind of, -1 to 0 and then from 1 to 100?
I think this is really a symptom of the fact that most of us grew up in a project world. So in a project where, and this really dates back to even the beginning of the internet and the way that a lot of companies used to rely on design agencies to do discovery and to do the research,
Mhm.
and to do like big upfront design. And part of that is because companies historically undervalued design and we didn't hire them internally. We just paid agencies to do it. Thankfully, that's changing. Most companies now have internal designers, and we're letting our internal teams do this work. But we've brought that outside agency model into our organizations. And some of this, it's not just coming from design agencies. It's also based on an IT model where we think about what we build as a project, and a project has a beginning and a middle and an end, and we can kick off the project with some research. Whereas if we think about digitally native companies that are building digital products, and that's was their core, that's where they were founded, they don't think about it as projects. They think about it as, we're building this thing and we're going to evolve it over time. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's always evolving. And if our product is always evolving, we're always making decisions about what to build, and we always need strong feedback loops on, are we making good decisions? And continuous discovery really is just continuous feedback loops. If we're continuously deciding what to build, we need continuous feedback that we're either on the right track or not. So I think what we're seeing is more companies are recognizing that what they're doing is not a project. It doesn't start and end. And actually, even the companies that did work in this project model, they knew it was never a project, right? Like, we always released something and then stakeholders had to like argue for a version 2 because we never got it right the first time. The problem is we also never came back into that version 2 because that new shiny thing always wins out. And so I think some of this is why we're seeing companies shift from an output mindset to an outcome mindset. It's why we're seeing dedicated product teams on the same product over time. It's why we're moving to things like continuous integration and continuous deployment. It's why the Agile Manifesto had such a huge impact, right? Like, all of these things are circling around the exact same idea, which is, we're not going to get things 100% right the first time. And even if we did, the market's going to evolve. Our customers' needs are going to evolve. What's possible with technology is going to evolve. And our products need to always be evolving if we want to stay successful.
I suspect there are some people listening to this who would say, this makes complete sense, but, my organization, that's not how they do it. They're a little more old school, or maybe command and control, or top down, whatever. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on an example where you've seen an organization embrace customer discovery and customer centricity and continuous kind of learning and be successful doing it. Like, how do you change the way a company operates? Because it seems like that's lots of resistance to change in many layers.
I think the only way you change an organization is when the leadership team is bought in, and it drives the change. So you need C-level executive sponsoring, not just sponsoring, driving, advocating for day to day, making sure the change is happening. And then on top of that, one of the things I often say is, organizations don't change, people change. And so in order for our organization to change, we need a significant percentage of the people in the organization to change. Now, I'll say right now, there's sort of a conversation happening on LinkedIn. Marty Kagan did an interview on Lenny Rachitsky's podcast, and he argued the individual product managers that are not changing the way they work are responsible for why their organizations are not changing. He didn't quite say that, but some people are interpreting it as if he said that. What he said was, as an individual product manager, you have the ability to be the change you want to see. I actually said this exact same thing at Product at Heart in Hamburg, Germany in June. I think every single individual contributor, regardless of how your organization works, has the ability to start taking steps in the right direction. We have more agency than we think. Now, where I think he got some pushback, which I think is fair, some people like Melissa Perry wrote a response to that interview, and she basically said that's underestimating the systemic factors that are at play that are keeping organizations from changing. So here's my take on this. If you're an individual product manager and your organization does not work this way at all, you have a couple of options. You could just be like, look, my organization doesn't work this way. I can't influence change. I'm going to do nothing. I'm just going to keep working the way that I work, and I'm going to complain about it. That's option one. Option two, which is the complete further end of the spectrum, is I'm going to spend all my time and energy trying to get my organization to change. I'm going to keep running into the brick wall over and over and over again. And I'm going to complain that everybody else in my organization is dumb and they're not doing it right. That's also not effective, right? There's a middle ground here. The middle ground is I can look at my own work habits. This is why I titled my book Continuous Discovery Habits. I can look at how I personally work. I can increase my exposure to customers. I can work to identify my underlying assumptions. I can work on having an outcome mindset. I do not need anybody else in my organization to change for me to do this. I can improve my quality of work by adopting the discovery habits. And when I do that, when I improve my quality of work, other people in the organization start to get curious about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it differently and how I'm getting better results. And that's what starts to instigate and influence change in your immediate area. When you do that enough, you start to get influence even more in the organization. And we've shared stories of this on the Product Talk blog. So recently we shared a story of a single team at Henmet. They're a company in one of the Scandinavian countries. I can't remember which one offhand. And they had a single team start to experiment with continuous discovery. They had a lot of success, and their product leader looked at that and said, we need to replicate this across the organization. And that was an example of an individual team influencing a lot of change in the organization. Now, they had a very supportive leader. And so sometimes you're going to be that individual team and you start to drive change and your leader is not going to be supportive of it. You still get to choose how you individually work. And I think that's the piece as an individual contributor to really focus on is how do I develop my own habits and how do I work better with my own team?
Yeah, that's such great advice. It reminds me of a previous experience where I was in an organization where there was a PM who made a really very, very strong arguments for how the organization was operating in the wrong way. And they spent a lot of time writing long documents about why everything was wrong and we had to do it differently. And unfortunately, it really kind of landed on deaf ears.
It often
And
does.
yeah, and it was like there's all kinds of reasons for that. But in hindsight, had this individual said, "Well, I am the PM for my project, and I'm going to kind of model this new approach that I think we should take," and if it then landed measurable outcome results, people would start to notice, like, "Huh, why is project 3 like looks like they're really something's going on over there." And then we would have been like, "Oh, how are you achieving these results? We should do more
Yeah.
of this," versus the other way, which is like, "You guys all don't know what you're doing. Like, here's what you need to do."
Here's the
But that's
thing.
yeah.
No human wants to be told what to do, right? And it's a lot of hubris. If you're an individual contributor, there's a lot of hubris involved in saying to your senior leaders, I know
Hmm.
what we should be doing more than you should. Like, think about that. That's a failing
Yeah.
strategy. Like, you're going to go to your boss and say you're doing everything wrong. Like, look, I've been there. I've been that stupid individual contributor that thought that I had all the answers, right? A lot of this comes from being early in our career, thinking we have more experience than we do, being very ambitious and eager. These are good things, right? It means you care. It means you're engaged in your career. You like your profession. But here's the thing, we focus our energy on what everybody else is doing, and we come across as jerks. We should be focusing on our energy on what we're doing and how we're working. And it's so easy to give the platitude show, don't tell, but that's what this is all about. Do the work yourself. Now, I tell people this every day, and every day people push back and say, but I don't have access to customers, but I don't have time, but I can't do this. You can find a way to take a teeny tiny step in the right direction and then find the next teeny tiny step. And anybody who thinks they can't do a single thing to go in the right direction is not being honest with themselves. Everybody, and I've seen some pretty crazy work environments. Every single individual contributor on the planet has agency and has the ability to do some of this. You might not be able to do all of it. It may not be able to be perfect, but you can do some of it. And I think if every single individual contributor in product management, design, engineering started to think this way, change in our industry would happen way faster than we realize.
Yeah, it reminds me of this analogy. I just finished this book. I think a lot of people probably already read it. Connect, about like difficult conversations. And one of the pieces of advice they give is uh, when you're giving feedback to really focus on your side of the tennis net. That if
Mhm.
you keep telling other people like, well, you didn't do this right and you made this call, versus like, hey, here's what I'm perceiving, here's what I'm doing, that seems like it's having some good results. I just want to kind of share it with you. That's where you have more control and agency, and then it doesn't elicit kind of the defensive response when you're kind of telling other people like they're doing it all wrong kind of thing.
Yep.
So yeah, it's great advice there, Teresa. What the other thing I was curious to get your thoughts on was this notion of who does product discovery. Is it the UXR people? Is it the designers? Is it the PMs kind of working in it? Is it the engineers? Is it like everybody? How do you think about who should be participating? Because, not everybody has the time, or they may not be as fired up to do it, depending on the individual or their function.
Yeah, I believe if we want to make good decisions about what to build, we need to do discovery as a team sport. And most companies, that's going to be a product manager, a designer, and a software engineer working together from the very beginning when deciding what to build. Now, there's other roles involved, right? So some products are super data heavy. Maybe they have a full-time data scientist on their team. They could be involved in that. Some companies have the luxury of user researchers and user researchers embedded on their team. This idea of discovery versus user research is sort of a hot topic. I think they overlap, but they're not the same thing. We have some companies where user research is centralized. They're their own role. They're probably not embedded on a team. So I personally believe the team that is building the product needs to be doing their own discovery. And that's because I think in order for it to be actionable, they need firsthand exposure to that feedback loop. Some teams that I've worked with have a researcher embedded, some don't. Just like some teams that I've worked with have a data scientist embedded, others don't. I've worked with teams that have journalists embedded. I've worked with teams that have marketing and product marketing embedded. So this comes in all types of flavors. I would say at a minimum, we want a product manager, a designer, and a software engineer doing their discovery together.
And what is your take on the difference and overlap between user experience research and product discovery?
I think there are areas where they're completely different, and there are areas where there is some overlap. So here's where I'll say they're completely different. When a product team is trying to evaluate what to build, they have dozens and dozens of questions that they need fast answers to. So if I'm trying to decide between solution A and solution B, and I break them down into their underlying assumptions, I might test half a dozen assumptions or more from each idea. I'm running through these tests in a week or two. Each test I'm spending a few hours to a day on. It's really fast iterative cycles. I'm not looking for perfect data. I'm looking for a signal. Is one of these solutions better than the other? That is purely in the realm of product discovery. I think it needs to be done by product teams themselves. Let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum. Product teams are never going to have time for longitudinal studies, things like diary studies, things where we're studying customer behavior over time. That's a great type of research that you're going to see a traditional user research team do. They're going to have better research methods. They have more skill in that area. So those are the easy pulls, right? We have some types of research questions that clearly fall in the longer research projects that are more suited for a skilled user researcher. We have fast daily feedback signals that we need to collect that I think are better suited for product teams. And then we have a huge gray area where I've seen everything and anything under the sun, where sometimes user researchers run all the usability studies for product teams. And if you're staffed to do that and that's not a bottleneck for your teams, great. I think user researchers are skilled at that and will do a great job at that. Most teams don't have enough user researchers to do that and they become a bottleneck. In that case, I want to see more of that being pushed to the product team so that we can keep moving. There's not a right or wrong answer here. There's a lot of options. I think the key is based on the people that you have. What's the right setup for your organization?
What's your take, Teresa, on how often PM should be interacting with customers or users? I remember years ago there was a rule of thumb, like you should try and get out of the office, once a week kind of thing, or a couple times a month. Rarely do I see that actually happen, especially as organizations get bigger. What's your sense on how often that should happen, and how structured it should be? Like, is hopping on a sales call considered, customer kind of interaction and discovery, or is it really should be kind of dedicated time?
I think when we're talking about discovery, I recommend two key activities that teams are doing on a regular basis. The first is interviewing. So, customer interview is not just I'm going to have a conversation with Tom. There needs to be a little bit more structure to that. We need to make sure we're asking the right questions. We need to make sure we're collecting reliable feedback. I think that a user researcher is skilled enough to conduct a dozen different types of interviews. When I talk about discovery interviews, I teach one type of interview that I think product teams can do reliably week over week. And the purpose of those types of interviews is to uncover unmet customer needs, pain points, and desires. I describe that method in my book, Continuous Discovery Habits. But the idea of those interviews, I want to see teams doing at least one a week. I've worked with teams that literally do one every day. That's usually because they have a lot of access to their customers. I've worked with some teams that have really struggled to get to every week because their customers are things like people like Fortune 500 CEOs or physicians during COVID. So you got to adjust that benchmark based on your context. But the vast majority of teams that I've worked with have been able to reliably do at least one interview every week. What I like about that as a benchmark is we make product decisions every single day. All of us, we do. And so I want to see at least on a weekly basis that we're getting some feedback that we're on the right track or not. The second activity that I encourage teams to do is assumption testing. And assumption testing is a really great feedback loop tied to solutions. And it's also a great way to learn about our customers, to see where we believe something that may not be true. A lot of the teams, when they're fully ramped up on this process, they are running multiple assumption tests a week. And so you may be getting daily feedback from customers through your assumption tests. Now, one area where I get pushback, and especially from user researchers, is why am I not recommending that you go and observe your customers? Observing customers is like the gold standard of what we want to be doing and learning from our customers. Most teams, most product teams, it is not sustainable to observe our customers every single week. So what I recommend is at a minimum, interview every week, observe when you can.
This has been a great conversation, Teresa. Was there anything, any other hot topics that were on your mind that you want to share while we're connected? And then I want to ask you about how people can learn more about what your organization does.
I think we really touched on it. The one thing I want to leave everybody with is I hear a lot from people that are just so frustrated by the fact that what they read sounds so ideal. It doesn't sound pragmatic. Their company doesn't work this way. They've never seen it. I really want to encourage you to don't think about it as you have to do everything or nothing. Think about it as like in my book, I wrote it as a collection of habits. I did that by design. I want you to start with the habit that's easiest for you to adopt. So just pick one. What's the easiest place for you to take this first teeny tiny step? And then just iterate from there. And we make way, there's a, I think maybe Bill Gates said it. I think a lot of people have said something like this, where uh, we overestimate what we can do in a year and we underestimate what we can do in a decade. And I think I might have gotten that backwards. The idea is that like we make progress, we don't make as much progress in the short term as we think, but we make way more progress in the long term than we realize. And I think this applies to discovery. So if you're worried
Mm.
about like what it's going to look like a month from now and you're starting small, you might have only made a small change. But by the end of the year, if you're doing that continuously, you'll be able to look back and your practices will really have evolved in a good way.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And how can people learn more about what you're up to, and kind of keep learning, going deeper on these topics with Product Talk and your organization?
Yeah, so I blog at producttalk.org. If these ideas are brand new to you, what I recommend is go to producttalk.org/continuous-discovery. That's an article that just covers the product discovery basics. If that resonates with you, my book is Continuous Discovery Habits. It's available worldwide in paperback, Kindle, EPUB, Audible. And then I do have a couple of webinars that I'll let people know about. I am doing a webinar on the what and why of continuous discovery on Monday, March 24th. You can find that at producttalk.org. On the right rail, if you're looking at the blog, there's an event section. I'm also doing a webinar on April 2nd on continuous interviewing and the value of story-based interviewing. So if that's a new concept to you, come check that out. And then I'm doing a webinar on April 3rd, all about identifying the assumptions that your solutions depend upon. And that webinar really is all about how do you get to faster discovery cycles. You can find all of those at producttalk.org.
Love it. I will drop some links in the description for folks on replay as well. This is great. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Teresa.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for having me.
Take care. Bye. All right. That was Teresa Torres, who has spent most of her career now talking about product discovery. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought, and if you have any follow-up questions. My general reaction is I think the point about you've got to play the long game and not necessarily expect to miraculously change everything in your organization or discover like amazing things on day one, but that if you can introduce these small habits incrementally over time, you'll look up and a year or two from now, your product will be much better off, and maybe your company will have really embraced it much more thoroughly. I also love the conversation Teresa and I had about agency and around how PMs, um, sometimes I think, especially maybe earlier mid-career PMs, it is very tempting to point out all of the things that are wrong with an organization. And that sometimes can be like not very constructive. That the best thing you can do is like change what you have control over and improve it and show, not tell. Um, and then it'll kind of like ripple through, but it takes longer and you have to be more patient, and your results need to be pretty clear. If you're like, hey, we need to do it this other way and we're not, and then you do it that other way on your project and it doesn't demonstrate success, then it's going to be hard for the rest of the organization to be like, oh yeah, let's go the way that Tom said. So um, a lot of food for thought there. Hopefully this was interesting to you. Please do me a solid, like and share. It helps grow the pod and spread the good word. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Bye, team.